I'm David Pepose, the writer of Spencer and Locke, Going to the Chapel, and the O.Z on Kickstarter, and you're watching Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comic, film, TV, movie, and video game industries. And of course, I'm your host, Kurt Sasso. We are joined today with another guest on the show. He's a first timer on Two Geeks Talking. The joy of Twitter and social media, you find so many great interviews, which brought to my attention a Kickstarter campaign, which brought to my attention this creative, amazing, talented person. I'll let him tell you all the stories that he has in store, but the comic we'll be talking about today, with a Kickstarter campaign that has 10 or so days left.
We've got 10 days left on this campaign. I'm David Pepose. Oh yeah, there you go. I didn't mean to step on your reveal.
That's okay. The guest we have today, and since I revealed it, I'm just going to jump right into it. We have David Pepose, the creator of course, the O.Z, Spencer and Locke, and
Going to the Chapel.
Going to the Chapel. Thank you. This is the reason why I'm not married. Thank you, Dave, for coming on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Kurt. I'm excited to make my Two Geeks Talking debut. I'm excited to be 50% of this ratio today, and I'm stoked to talk to you about my new Kickstarter book, The O.Z. It's been a book that's been in development for a long time, and if you want to read a book that's what if Mad Max and the Hurt Locker took place in the Wizard of Oz, this is the book for you. You're really gonna love it. We take a fun, action-packed twist on the classic L. Frank Baum mythology, and we're able to take a new twist on Oz that I don't think anybody's seen before.
I was watching the Kickstarter video you had for it, and it's a great summary, and it looks like it definitely looks action packed. It looks amazingly drawn and colored. I mean, it looks beautiful to be perfectly honest. So is this a story that was kind of rattling around your brain, or was this something that you're like, you know what, I love these, these old stories. I want to make it into a graphic novel.
Yeah, for me, I kind of stumbled into this idea. For those who haven't read my first book, Spencer and Locke, it was what if Calvin and Hobbes grew up in Sin City. And so this is not my first rodeo in terms of remixing childhood nostalgia and weaponizing it to a degree. The O.Z, though, it's been in the works for a very long time. Since that first volume of Spencer and Locke came out, at the time, when it came out, people really responded strongly to it. We were nominated for Ringo Awards. We were optioned. Our reviews were universally positive. But in hindsight, that might look like a slam dunk. It was certainly not a slam dunk while we were making that book. I was half convinced I was going to get run out of the industry for that book. And so it took a little while for me to say, okay, I'm going to make a run at this comics writing thing, because I didn't know if that was going to be the only book I'd ever get to write. So the O.Z kind of came, it was one of the three ideas that I had on the heels of Spencer and Locke. So this is dating back 3 years now. The first one was Spencer and Locke 2, which I had in my back pocket from the beginning. Going to the Chapel, which is kind of Die Hard meets Wedding Crashers, which came out a year ago yesterday. And then the O.Z, I had said, well, I want to take a big swing. I've written crime. I was working on a rom-com. I wanted a big swing kind of genre. And I've written sci-fi since then, but at the time, it was really hard. I was just thinking, for sci-fi, you kind of have to come up with the rules of the world, and then your characters have to navigate that world. Whereas fantasy, I feel like you have the opportunity to have it be the opposite, where there's so much theme and metaphor and characterization that could kind of warp the rules of the world. And that's great. I mean, there's a reason why I've always gravitated to characters like Shazam or Doctor Strange for that same reason. And so I had written almost like a mood board on a Google Doc, just things from my upbringing and my childhood that I could use to look to for inspiration. So I'd written things like Lord of the Rings or Lloyd Alexander or Piers Anthony or Harry Potter, and I wrote down The Wizard of Oz. And as I saw my cursor kind of flashing on the word Oz, I realized, that word's so short, but it's so iconic. What if that was an acronym for something? And I thought of the comic DMZ, and I said, oh, it's the occupied zone. And that's when it really kind of hit me like a bolt of lightning that this wasn't just a fantasy book, but a war story. And I realized that that could really kind of scratch that genre blending itch that I've enjoyed so much with Spencer and Locke and Going to the Chapel. But we're able to take it, I think, on a much larger scale than any books that I've written before.
So we'll dive into the OZ for sure, but I want to know about your other books first here, because you hinted at it with Spencer and Locke.
Yeah.
Why as a writer, as a creator of a beloved genre like Calvin and Hobbes, thought that you were going to be run out of the industry, especially when you were nominated for a Ringo Award?
Well, it was in the process of making it, because like I said, that high concept is flammable. Spencer and Locke was a book that dealt with some really heavy subject matter. We dealt with childhood trauma and abuse and PTSD and mental illness. And, Calvin and Hobbes is one of the most sacred cows in the comics industry, and for good reason. Bill Watterson is a visionary and a trailblazer and a pioneer. And the amount of innovation that he was able to put in such a relatively small canvas is just nothing short of miraculous. And so my thinking at the time was, one, are we going to be able to sort of stick the landing in terms of presenting this in a way that like everyone will agree we're going out of our way to be sensitive and not treat it as titillating or as a punchline. But also, more importantly, just what's the ratio of people who are such Calvin and Hobbes purists that they would not want this thing to exist just out of principle. And thankfully, I knew there's going to be a ratio of people who liked that book and a ratio of people who hated it just for existing, and I didn't know what that was going to look like. Thankfully, 99.9% of people who read that book really loved it. I can count on one hand the number of people who just didn't like it based on it existing, and that's fine. I don't think you're ever going to hit 100% with those sorts of things. But yeah, the fact that ratio kind of played out in our favor kind of emboldened me to make a go with this. It's funny, I grew up in the Midwest. I raised in St. Louis. I didn't know any professional writers growing up. It didn't seem like not even a viable career path. It seemed like a different planet. You have no idea how to get there. And even when I interned at DC Comics in college, I worked on books like Final Crisis and Batman R.I.P. Back in 2008. Even then, it still felt like, okay, the only way to like really have a career in this is if you work corporate, if you're working as an editor or something like that. And so the reason I wrote Spencer and Locke initially was I had said, well, maybe I can either be a comics editor, or because I was working at CBS in New York at the time, maybe I could transition to becoming a development executive. And I thought, oh, if I can show that I can break down a story, what better way of proving that than by writing one of my own? Which in hindsight, it's like you're putting the cart before the horse, genius. Like, if you can write a good story, maybe that's your job instead of like doing all this rigmarole of being an editor or a development exec, which I have found has all my least favorite parts of being an indie comics creator with none of the benefits. I'm used to having to kind of herd the cats and, figure out the budgeting and the scheduling and giving people notes, all of which are things that like fill me with dread and anxiety. So if I'm going to do that, I might as well also get to have the fun stuff of, steering the ship and having it be my ship. It did not seem like a slam dunk at the time. And every time an issue of Spencer and Locke would come out, especially because the way we structured it is every first page of every issue was drawn as a Bill Watterson homage. And so it would be kind of a roller coaster ride. Our very first page of that book, we had Spencer and Locke, who are our analogs for Calvin and Hobbes. It was a flashback to their childhood. And they go out at 3 a.m. They're racing their wagon, down the hill. And, Locke's mom shows up. And you're just thinking, oh, okay, this is a normal Calvin and Hobbes kind of storyline. And then she just like flies off the handle and beats the hell out of them. And you're like, oh, okay, this is a very different book. That one page was a real roller coaster. And that sort of, when you have every issue like that, you're like, okay, we hope that we've like done our due diligence. We hope that like something that I always talked about with my artist George Santiago Jr. was just, how do we do this in a way that's not trying to romanticize child abuse or trying to turn it into a joke, that it's serious and it's grotesque, and it has shaped the psyche of this now grown detective, where he was so profoundly alone that his only escape was to invent his own best friend. I think we took a major risk on that book, and I think that's part of the reason why we had so much success with it. Is you don't do that high concept quietly. Everyone's going to look to see if you stick the landing or if you eat dirt. And I think a lot of people were really surprised that, oh, like, they took this thing seriously, that they did not just do it for like edginess' sake, that they tried to actually tell a story about mental illness and PTSD and friendship and redemption. And yeah, I think that was the best possible foundation for my career, because I think it embodies a lot of the things that I believe as a storyteller, in that we have to tell stories that have some sort of accessibility and some sort of universality to them. I love the comics industry, but I think ever since we've had to sort of establish this direct market to save the industry, we've become a little insular. We've circled the wagons. We're preaching to the choir when we should be going out for converts.
Now, I'm just curious about that last statement you just said.
Yeah.
To stop being insular, we have to basically become our own bosses, is what you're trying to say?
Maybe our own ambassadors.
Yeah.
That are our own evangelists, if you really want to take it a step further. Because we live in a scattered media landscape. We live in a world where you've got every bit of entertainment you could possibly want in your pocket. You've got Netflix, you've got video games, you've got anything you could possibly want, and then a crowded marketplace for comics. And I think sometimes the comics industry, especially with our sort of long-running titles, it becomes uninviting for new readers. For me, my major demographic is people who are lapsed comics readers or people who have not read comics at all. Once you hit a certain generation, everybody has heard of Calvin and Hobbes. Even the young high school kids who have not read it, when I show them a picture of the original Calvin and Hobbes, they're like, "Oh yeah, I know exactly who that is."
Yeah.
And I say, "Well, imagine them meets True Detective," and people are like, "Oh, okay, I get it." And I think having that little bit of familiarity helps people kind of take that extra step forward. Everybody's a little trepidatious about trying something new, especially trying a new medium if they aren't really diehard comics fans. Having that little bit of universality to it, I think it makes all the difference. And then people realize, like, oh, there's a lot of different storytelling that could be told. It doesn't have to be capes and tights who are sort of constrained to this overarching meta text where you've got to know all this background information from decades ago. That's the benefit of the indies. You don't need exposition, or I should say, you don't need more than the standard amount of exposition. And I think we have a lot more latitude in picking topics and concepts that can appeal to a wider range of potential readers.
But the thing is but this has been ongoing for independent creators before the big two, or
sure,
during the 60s, 70s as well, when underground comics first got started, though.
Yeah.
So you go into the 90s, you go into the webcomic creators, you go into already those established or soon to be established comic creators from back in that time period.
Sure.
And they weren't fighting against the big two or the big three with Image, if you consider Image the big three at that point.
Sure.
They were creating their own works. They were still gathering their own audiences, and they're still creating their own products to fight against the syndications and to fight against those that weren't given the chance to have their own voices.
Mm-hmm.
So taking a concept like what you have here, while nothing new, it's still utilizing a predetermined or pre-created.
The fact that we're building on something that pre-exists.
That's already
for sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, and I think we do this with Spencer and Locke, and we do it with the O.Z. as well, is that for me it's always kind of like, what's considered, if not universally known, what's considered cultural osmosis.
Yeah.
But even things like my other book, Going to the Chapel, that's not based on any pre-existing property, even though I pitch it as Die Hard or Ocean's 11 meets Wedding Crashers and Arrested Development.
Mm-hmm.
Those are just more like comp titles, but I feel like everybody's been in love before, or everybody's been to a wedding, or everybody's had dysfunctional family. And if you haven't had dysfunctional family, you're the dysfunctional member of the family. So I think for me, it's sort of figuring out like, what's the accessibility factor. Even if you haven't read Calvin and Hobbes, Spencer and Locke is all about trauma, and it's how trauma shapes you. And can we overcome our past, or are we always going to be defined by them? And I think that's always been a through line through my work, is trauma and exploring that, and sort of making my characters, they're forced to face it, and then they have to decide, are they going to change? Can they change, or are they going to be stuck in this? And I think the ability of, if not transcending your scars, but kind of living with them, I think that's cathartic for a lot of readers. I think that really does offer a message of hope and inspiration, even if it's not one that readers can necessarily articulate at the time. But I think that's part of the reason why why Spencer Locke was kind of written as a dark story, and The O.Z. a little less so, but still fairly dark, is that it makes those redemptive arcs, I think, shine that much much brighter, I should say, in contrast.
So who were your artists then on, we're gonna jump to The O.Z. next, but who are your artists for Spencer and Locke?
Yeah, George Santiago Jr. Was our line artist and my co-creator on the book. He's terrific. He's my ride or die. He has never shied away from a challenge, and I have thrown him many. That first volume of Spencer and Locke, because I didn't know if I'd get to tell another story, I called it my bucket list comic. I threw in anything that I thought would be considered cool. Car chases, sci-fi, dinosaurs. Some of it was just because if I only got to tell one comic, I wanted to pack it all in this one. But also just like, so I wouldn't drag George down with me if people didn't like the book. I wanted to give him like a full portfolio that he could show editors and say, like, I can do all this stuff, so like, please give me work. And I worked with colorist Jason Smith, who's terrific. He and George, I think they work together really nicely in terms of their work. And letterer Colin Bell, who I've known for a better part of a decade from my time over at Newsarama. So yeah, they were really a dream team. They were all nominated for Ringo Awards for their contributions to that first volume. And they actually all just earned another nomination for Spencer and Locke 2 just last week. For best single issue for our first issue of the sequel. They were the ones who took a leap of faith on me when I had nothing to show for it. And I think they are each so committed to putting out the best possible work. We were kind of like the little indie that could when that book came out. Kind of nobody really expected much out of us based on the strength of my collaborators and the strength of our amazingly passionate readership. I think we were allowed to punch way outside of our weight class.
Nice. So who designed the covers?
So George Santiago Jr. did our main covers for that series, but we also had two amazing variant artists on board for Spencer and Locke. Mon House, who he works with me doing variants on every single book. He's got a variant for the O.Z. as well, and did variants for Going to the Chapel. And then Joe Mulvey, who is another terrific artist. I love him to death. He did a round of variants for he did our first issue for volume 1, and then he did a whole round of variants for volume 2. He's got a really cool pinup in the O.Z. as well. I was still kind of learning the ropes of variant covers a bit, and I still think I am, because I think they have a unique role in the ecosystem, and sometimes they can be abused, and sometimes they can be seen as additive, and it's kind of hard to strike that balance. For me, I had always looked at variants as just, if somebody doesn't like the main cover, maybe a variant will help tip them over the net. And so, having somebody who is different stylistically, I feel like Mon is much more photorealistic. He's got almost like a spooky vibe to his work, but also one that's very graphical, not graphic violence. And then Mulvey, meanwhile, is like much more cartoony and exaggerated. Yeah. When I first found his work, and this was over a decade ago, I was always like, oh, this is kind of like a real Joe Mad, Ed McGuinness kind of vibe. A true murderer's row of talent, and one that deserves every award you can throw at them.
Yeah, it's amazing because the covers kind of triggered in my mind another creator as well, Jules Rivera. She does very
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
similar style to, especially when I saw the first couple, and going to the chapel as well. I'm like, yeah, the tones, the figurines, and that's why I thought it was another creator like that. But I'm glad to see it's a
I know Jules. She's great.
yeah, she's awesome. That because it was just like that first one looked very similar to Marsh Rocket, just like the stylization of it. I was just like,
Oh, interesting.
so I was like, that's why I asked. I was curious. So the OZ is, 10 days left. You're literally into stretch goal territory now. I mean, how fast was the response to get it fully funded?
It was pretty crazy. This is my first Kickstarter. And granted, it was not my first book, and I think we had a bit of a platform established on the success of Spencer and Locke and Spencer and Locke 2 and Going to the Chapel. And I had built up a lot of relationships in the press over the course of those 3 books. And having been on the scene for over a decade, I've been really fortunate enough to meet a lot of comics creators. And so, between the readership and the retailers and the press and the creators, everybody really kind of came together hard to lift up our book, which I couldn't be more grateful about. We funded in 2 hours, which is insane.
Yeah.
I had spent the previous night like having a panic attack, like freaking out about Kickstarter has a something on the back end button that says prepare to launch.
Mm-hmm.
And I was having like an existential crisis of, does that mean that if I click this, it launches immediately? Or do I have to go through another round of approvals? Am I going to miss my launch date? My poor girlfriend had to look it up for me because I was just too terrified to look on my own. You go into these things thinking, okay, I'm trying to make $6,000. It'll pay for the majority of the art. I'll eat the print costs. How can I get this funded in 30 days? No one expects you to overshoot at the rate and speed that we did. It's like stepping out for a sandwich and winding up in the moon. There's no preparation for that, because preparing for that would be the height of hubris. And so that's been like an interesting and fun challenge and learning curve for me. Is Kickstarter really is its own planet with its own laws of physics, distinct from the direct market. And so for me, it's been about how do we keep bringing people to the table, because that's the reason I did Kickstarter in the first place. Like, trust me, we're doing 140 pages of story by the time that all 3 of our Kickstarters are done. Between that and printing and shipping, I'm not getting rich off this book. I just wanted to bring more people to the table. And as a result, it's like, how do we find more ways to bring more bang for the buck? How do we keep enhancing what we've already got? So, we've been doing stretch goals. We are talking with our printer now about enhanced covers, probably something with UV rays, but we're trying to see if Ruben Rojas's art will lend itself to a metallic or a foil cover. We've got added pinups that are going into the books, which are already 44 pages of story to begin with. We've got our digital stretch goals that have been unlocked. So you're going to get a dozen PDFs from indie creators like Justin Jordan, Rylan Grant, Frank Gogol, Kevin Eastman, the co-creator of the Ninja Turtles, much more. So even if you throw in just $10 to get the PDF, you're getting something like 300 pages of story already. We're just unlocked a stretch goal earlier this week. I think it was yesterday morning. So all of our backers are going to get a or all of our physical backers are going to get a book-sized print from Kira Okamoto,
Nice.
Our Yellow Brick Road Warrior print, as well as our Winged Monkey Squadron sticker, Monkey See, Monkey Doom. And then all of our tiers have all sorts of fun stuff to it. Starting at our $10 tier. Well, I should go back. Our $5 tier, which is just our thank you tier, you will still get the first issue PDFs of Spencer and Locke and Going to the Chapel, just as a thank you. That will be in every single tier, because this is all about inviting new readers to the table, and people who might not be familiar with my other work, we want to introduce them to that. We've also got my scripts, so you'll have access to my scripts when we send that out. Our $15 pledge, you also get access to Ruben Rojas's raw inks and Whitney Kogar's untouched colors, so you get to kind of see the behind the scenes process there. And that's everything just before you start hitting physical rewards. We've got 4 awesome covers to this book by Ruben Rojas, Mon House, Rio Burton, and Kenneth Wagnon. And if you decide to buy all 4, you actually get it for the price of 3. We've also got deals involving my previous trade paperbacks. So if you want to get our print stockpile, you can get the trade paperbacks for Spencer and Locke, Spencer and Locke 2, and go into the chapel as well with that.
I'm just looking at this artwork. It's beautiful. I mean,
Thank you.
I have the Kickstarter up right now currently, so it's
Yeah. I think this comes from my time at DC and my time of being a critic, is that I'm very picky with who I work with. I want to make sure that not only do I like their style and do I feel like it fits with the book, but I always appreciate working with artists who are as hungry as I am to succeed. For an industry where you're constantly having to re-break yourself in every single time, I feel like sometimes it can be seen as almost workmanlike, where you're like, oh, okay, like I'll get this thing out, and if it's not the best thing in the world, well, maybe the next thing will be. And for me, I put a lot of pressure on myself, where I'm like, no, I like, if it's not right, then we have to make it right. We're asking readers to part with their hard-earned money, and ultimately the thing that travels with you from book to book, it's not the sales numbers, it's not the royalties, it's not awards or options or whatever you want to do, it's reputation. That's the currency you bring with you, issue to issue, book to book, and I never want to take that for granted with our readership. There's a lot of books out in the stands, and the thing that really helps set you apart is not just your execution, but the trust you build with your readership. And so I treat every book as my first at bat, because I need to re-earn my trust with every single new book I put out.
Is there a reasoning why? I mean, the fact that you've already established yourself with your other books, though, is this more of a personal flaw that you have, or do you just want to make sure that you do everything right, the same thing time over and over again?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, I'm sure some of it's a defense mechanism, a survival tactic, is that, I want to be a 30-year man. I want to be somebody like Grant Morrison or Dan Slott. The shelf life of a comics writer is not always huge. And some of that is just because of like tolerance for pain and like financial stability. Like, there are people who just say like, I need to earn a living, like, and if I'm not getting enough work in comics, then I'm going to try something else, which like, there's no shame in that, whatsoever. The comics industry can sometimes have a short memory. And that's because there's so many people who are bringing their A game, and so many people who are desperate to get in. Yeah, I never want to rest on my laurels. I think that would be the worst thing that could ever happen. I've tried all the stable jobs. I think that's why I value being a comics writer so much. Is I've been a reporter. I've worked in corporate, in television. I've worked as a lit assistant. None of those jobs really played to my strengths the way that comics writing does. And so I don't take it for granted. And I feel like there are a lot of other writers out there who are just more naturally talented than me on that. I think the difference that will always equalize it is, how hard am I willing to work at this? I'm going to treat every book like it's the last one, because it might be. And, leaving it all out in the field, I don't know. I think that it shows in the final product, which is funny, because usually I say, a reader won't know how long it took for you to make that book. They won't know if there was a year between Spencer and Locke and Spencer and Locke 2, or 2 years in between Spencer and Locke 2 and our upcoming Spencer and Locke 3. They're just gonna love it when they read it. But I do think that they can feel the enthusiasm, and they can feel that we have done everything in our power to make these books the best we possibly can. And there's still room to grow. And I think also pushing myself as hard as I can with every single book, that's also the way for me to improve as a creator.
How long have you been a writer, though?
Spencer and Locke was my first book. When I was a newspaper reporter, I was feeling kind of restless. This was about almost 10 years ago. I wrote a short script every day. And it was, again, that sort of thinking of maybe I can become an editor if I do this. Looking back, that sweet, naive child. I wrote a short script every day for 90 days. And a lot of them weren't good, which is fine. That was kind of the big breakthrough that I had, was they didn't have to be good. They just had to be finished. I put in my reps, and I was like, nobody has to see this. I just have to learn from it. A lot of those ideas are rotting in a folder that no one will see. I remember distinctly, I had one, it was during when Charlie Sheen had his breakdown. And so like I had a story just like called Rock Stars from Mars. It was a terrible, this is Spinal Tap riff. Some of those scripts I have actually strip mined ideas from for longer work. It was sort of just putting in the reps and learning from my mistakes and not being as precious with my ideas, because I knew you can always come up with a new idea. What happens is ultimately, high concepts are great, but like the execution is really the thing that will keep people interested in that. Mm-hmm. And then I met my girlfriend Claire, or my partner Claire, she likes it when I call her that. I met her living in New York City, and I was tinkering with the idea of trying a screenplay. I had never done one before, and I mentioned it to her, and she got really excited. She's a voracious reader of fiction. She's a magazine editor. At first, I just started writing kind of to impress her. And then seeing how she reacted to my scripts, I was kind of like, okay, like, I'm going to keep doing this. This seems like fun. So I wrote a screenplay. I wrote a couple of TV scripts. And again, still thinking maybe I'd become a development executive. Maybe I'd become an editor. Spencer and Locke kind of, that was my first attempt at a longer comic script. I wrote the first issue. I was like, yeah, that was fun. Let me see if I would just write an outline, just, for funsies, see how that feels. I wrote that. I was like, that's cool. And so I emailed a bunch of artists just to be like, oh, I'd love to see how an artist portrays this. And George Santiago Jr. got on board, and Jason Smith and Colin Bell. And I was like, you know what? Like, nothing's going to happen with this, but maybe I should just like shop this around just for funsies, just to see what might happen. And then I got an email from Action Lab saying, how soon do you think you can get this book done? And then I felt like a cold chill run down my spine. And I was like, oh, I just tricked myself into selling a book. I guess I have to finish this. And like I said, even then I was kind of like holding my breath, even in the process of making and promoting Spencer and Locke. And as it was coming out and people really liking it, every time an issue came out, I was like, is this going to be where they turn on us? Is this where they decide we've pushed the envelope too hard and they don't like this book anymore? And that day never happened. And it was only sort of when the dust settled and all the issues came out and all the reviews were good, and I was like, oh, maybe this whole development executive thing, maybe that was dumb. Maybe I should just do this. And so yeah, I've been doing that ever since.
So as a fellow journalist, as a critic, and as a writer, when it comes to Newsrama and all that work that you've done there,
sure, what
did you learn from those experiences that will help you with your current writing?
My comics writing? It's funny. I always laugh. Newsrama, I considered it was like boot camp for me. It taught me everything that I could have possibly needed to barely get my first book across the finish line. Because you learn so much, but it's all academic until you put it into practice. And for me, I think the big benefit was, it kind of bolstered my newspaper training, in the sense that I could write on a deadline. I was not afraid of a word count. I tend to structure my stories a lot like newspaper articles, where I have sections that sometimes I just they're modular. I should sort of shift them around. And that's how I approach sequels as well. Is it's like you get a certain inch count or a certain word count, and that's the story you have to tell. But if you ever got more for the web version, what else would you add? Or if you had to do a follow-up, what would you say? Newsrama, though, I think was super helpful for me for a number of reasons. One was just having to very quickly have to analyze work and articulate what I liked and didn't like, and I had to really defend my choices. I think it really helped synthesize my voice in a big way. Kind of cherry picking my own influences, and also just things I didn't like. For example, I'm not a huge fan of decompressed storytelling, for example. I think it can be done well, but like if it turns into like talking head nonsense, it's not. I feel like I've wasted my money. So that's something like I don't like. Whereas the Babs Tarr run on Batgirl is an example of like really dense storytelling, where like you had like almost self-contained stories on an issue-to-issue basis that then came together for like a meta arc. And I was like, oh yeah, I really like that. So like Spencer Locke and Spencer Locke 2 in particular are like jam packed with story. The other thing that I think was really helpful for me is I had an interview column for a while called Writers Workshop and Artists Alley. And I just interviewed creators, just kind of asking about their process. And so I talked with people like Scott Snyder and Nick Spencer and Rick Remender and Greg Pak and Marjorie Liu, just to name a few. It felt like the scales had been lifted from my eyes a bit. Greg Pak in particular, he's been so gracious and generous to me for a long time. But I came up to him. I saw him at the Ringo Awards 2 years ago when Spencer Locke was nominated for some awards. And I told him, your interview with me changed the game for me. He told me that when he was growing up as a kid and he was like, maybe I'll try my hand at being a writer. He realized the only way he could do so was if he gave himself permission to be bad at it first. And just to kind of like churn through the crap in order to get to the good stuff. He was just like, I wrote a bunch of stories and they were terrible, but every story I finished, the next one was a little less terrible until they eventually became like good. And that was like one of the big aha moments for me was like, oh, I can just write it and like, that's okay. This doesn't have to be seen by anybody, or, this can be just a draft and we can rework this later, or I can just finish it and say I'm done with it and move on to the next thing. That was, I think, really formative for me. And a lot of the interviews that I've done, I've sort of taken little bits and pieces here and there. I remember Nick Spencer telling me at one point that like writing is like you're putting a blindfold on somebody and you're spinning them around and then you start leading them and they don't know which way you're going to go. And sometimes you kind of jerk them in one direction that, they don't think they're going in. And like what we do as writers is it's a little of manipulation, in that regard. We're the ones that get to set the roller coaster tracks and, and everybody else just gets to react to them. Yeah. And I think also Newsarama was really helpful for being just learning the lay of the land a little bit in terms of the general industry, in terms of the general press ecosystem. I think I had an advantage that a lot of other creators don't, in that I already read everybody else's sites. I was reading Major Spoilers and Graphic Policy and Adventures in Poor Taste and Multiversity, in addition to sort of the big places like Bleeding Cool and CBR and The Beat. So even though I didn't necessarily know a lot of people at those outfits, I could say, hey, you might have seen me at Newsarama, but I wanted to say I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. And I'm now taking the plunge into writing a comic of my own. Could we maybe talk about that? And, it's tough out there for a comics journalist, as I'm sure you can attest, is that it's a fire hose of content. There's never enough time. There's so many books. And what's worse is you have so many people who are kind of asking for your time, who, at risk of sounding maybe uncharitable, they're not quite ready for prime time. Yeah. And you never want to punch down. My philosophy was always sort of the ethical calculus would be, if I don't like a super indie book, it's not worth their time or mine to like punch down on them on a big platform. But it's tough. You got to sift through all that stuff. And that's on top of Marvel and DC putting a wrecking ball through your schedule anytime they want to have something with no embargo. Of course. But I think learning the lay of the land and just figuring out, like, I know what all the sites are. And not only that, as somebody who's been a journalist, I know how to like navigate a site to find contact info, which is a skill that like I'm sure you and I would take for granted. But as somebody who's never had journalism training, it can be very easy to just not make heads or tails of it, or worse, to expect your publisher to be doing all the heavy lifting for your publicity, because I can tell you most indies do not have the bandwidth to do so. If you're not going to promote your book, nobody else is going to. And moreover, nobody's going to love your baby the way that you do. So it really is incumbent upon you, for your sake and the sake of your creative team, to be pounding on every door you can and leave no stone unturned.
And social media truly does help out with that as well too, because it's been my main avenue actually for a good number of my interviews, just because of the connections I've had through comic conventions and whatever else. But it's also good to see when you're looking at those indie creators or people that you were interviewing back 10 years ago as well, and we kind of hinted about this in the green room, look at where they are now. Like there's been many interviews where I've had people that were original webcomic creators that are now working for Marvel and DC.
Yeah,
And it's amazing.
It's funny you say that because I have there's almost a 10-year age gap between me and my younger siblings. My younger siblings are triplets, which I think was a great preparation for the chaos of making comics. But they're recently out of school. They've been out, I think, a year or two now. And one of my brothers is out here in Los Angeles with me, and he's trying to make a go of it for the actual screenwriting track, which is even harder than comics, I think, in a lot of ways. And I remember when I got my first manager, my brother was kind of like, well, how did you do that? Like, I'm trying to get repped, and like, how did you do it? He thought kind of seemingly without effort. And I said, no, that's not it at all. I got my first representation from somebody that I met way back in 2008 when I was interning at DC, who had since become a comics writer, who since had representation, who introduced me to that representation. But the thing is that success in entertainment, and I think comics in particular, it's not measured in weeks or even months. It's years. That it's a small industry, but when you stay in it long enough, it's kind of shocking where people wind up. And so kind of it's incumbent upon all creators, especially when they're starting out, to just kind of reach out to as many of their peers as possible to sort of find themselves in that class, so to speak, of comics creators. Because in 5 years, you don't know who's going to wind up being nominated for awards or working, at a big name publisher. And I think if Kickstarter's taught me anything, a rising tide does float all boats. And while the direct market is a little different because there is a degree of scarcity in terms of shelf space and retailer budget, I think having that connectivity, it's not networking in the sense that, networking being sometimes kind of a dirty word. It's just building friendships and seeing kind of where that goes. It doesn't have to be transactional. It can just be having each other's backs. When you need a shoulder to cry on or a sounding board or somebody to vent at. I don't consider myself an overnight success one bit, because I feel like I've been chipping away at this since I was a sophomore in college. And it's only finally, like, I think I've kind of, people are now starting to trust me a little bit more, and they're saying, okay, he has 3 Ringo Award nominated books. He's got a Kickstarter that's been really popular. I have more stuff finally kind of coming out soon. Now people are starting to kind of be like, okay, this wasn't just a one-off. Like, maybe this guy has what it takes to do this long term.
And it's also impressive, the fact that your perseverance is a huge factor that I don't think a lot of people have. A lot of people get hurt from a simple rejection, or not getting the interview that you wanted, or being rejected at a comic convention for your very first time while trying to interview a celebrity while he's looking to smoke a cigar. There's a story behind that. But,
this sounds very specific. I wonder where you got that inspiration from.
10 years of 12 years of interviews. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. No, I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think for me, something that's always been very comforting is, I think, success in comics and entertainment as a whole. Yeah, there's some degree of talent involved, although I think talent can be developed. I don't think anyone, like, there are certain people that are born with just an inherent edge in the category, but like, you can work at it. Like, I think anybody can, if they have an open mind and they actually like take the time to like analyze other people's work and be honest about their own work, like, you can build yourself up to something that's of professional quality. But I think ultimately, like you said, it's perseverance. It's what's your threshold for pain. I something that I thought about this a lot when the pandemic started and Diamond had its temporary shutdown, which was really kind of the big catalyst that made me think, like, I'd wanted to do Kickstarter for a while and I didn't know what would be the best time to do it. And then meanwhile, I had 2 issues of the OZ done and in the can. And I was like, oh, like, duh, solve one problem with another. Let's give the OZ a home and introduce ourselves to Kickstarter with the highest possible A game. But, I said publicly, and you can see it on my Facebook, you can see it on my Twitter. It ultimately, your success just comes from getting your reps in and saying, I'm not going anywhere. No matter how many rejections you get back up and you either rework your stuff or you knock on more doors or you make your own opportunities. You can self-publish or go on, or put it on the web. But just saying, I'm not going anywhere. There are a lot of people who, the rejection hurts too much or real life gets in the way and they aren't able to give the comics that kind of focus because they have other things that are more pressing to them. So for as long as you can, just sort of digging your heels in and saying, I'm going to do this. And it doesn't mean that you have to be coming up with new pitches every 6 months. I mean, you also have to be creatively patient with yourself and you have to work within your bandwidth. Mm-hmm. But, I think the person who keeps taking swings, eventually one of them will connect. I've always said, I'm a survivor of the New York City online dating scene. And I think it has a lot in common with comics.
So it's Tinder for comic creators?
Kinda, like you have to deal with a lot of rejection. You have to you have enough sense of self to know that it's not always about you. It's not always personal. Sometimes it's just not the right fit. But the thing is like you can get 1,000 no's and all you need is the one right yes. Mm-hmm. And that was exactly what happened with all of my books. Spencer Locke, we pitched that all over town. A top 5 publisher told me, and I wear this as a badge of honor, that he said it was the best pitch he'd never publish. And I love that. That's great. Going to the Chapel, I pitched that all over town, and you would think after 5 Ringo Award nominations it'd be easier to get something through the door. And no, I can't tell you how many publishers said we love the concept and have no idea how to sell it. Now it's nominated for a Ringo. Patton Oswalt was giving us shout outs for it. Nice. Sometimes in retrospect it seems a lot more like a slam dunk than when you were in the thick of it. The O.Z, we had tons of publishers expressing interest in the book, but even in the best of times the acquisitions pipeline can be chaotic. We had one publisher who we talked about it, they seemed really excited. I was really pumped. I said, send us a contract, we'll get the ball rolling. They're like, yeah, give us a little bit of time, we'll get that right for you. And then a few months would go by, and then I'd start the conversation with them again, and it'd be like Groundhog Day. It'd be the exact same conversation, and it happened a few times. Eventually I just said, what am I waiting for permission for? We could just go straight to the readers and get this book out now, which is why I went to Kickstarter. I think comics, like any entertainment business, rejection is just, you're going to have to learn to love the taste of it. And at the same time, just know that like, it's that fine balance of, is your book ready for prime time and they're just not getting it, or they have a reason not to put it up, or is it not ready for prime time and you need to kind of go back and retinker? I've had pitches, I've had projects where I've been working with artists on it, and I kind of realize as those preliminary pages are coming in, oh, this thing needs to be retooled. Like, this thing is not right. I've had a few projects like that, and it's kind of tough. But I think if you're honest with yourself, you're going to save yourself a lot of pain pitching something that isn't ready. But if you know that it's ready and you believe in it and you believe in your team, then you need to knock on every possible door. And if a door is not going to open, then you need to break a window and make your own opportunities.
Or that's just called B&E in New York.
Yeah, don't get caught. But the thing is you've heard the analogy of breaking into comics is like breaking into prison, where if you find an entryway, they're going to just seal it up. So yeah, everybody's kind of got their own unique origin story as a result. But ultimately, it's like Shawshank. All it takes is one spoon and a whole lot of scoops. But eventually, you'll crack your way through that wall.
You're still crawling through shit to get to where you're going either way, too. So.
I'm still crawling through shit. I'm crawling through shit now. The sweet smell of that air on the other side, that's what keeps me going.
That and Febreze.
And Febreze.
So I have 4 last questions then to ask you, because time's flying by here. This has been great. Everyone has an inspirational person that kind of inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
Oh boy, I certainly have certain artistic inspirations. Devin Grayson is a huge one. I actually sent her a fan letter after Spencer Locke came out. her run on Batman Gotham Knights, it's criminal that has not been collected and trade. People like Jeff Johns, his work on JSA and Green Lantern was very, certainly kind of stitched into my writing DNA. I would say, though, it's probably kind of sappy to say it. I think my biggest inspiration is my partner, Claire. I feel like I would not be in this business without her. And she's my first reader. She's kind of my narrative North Star in a lot of ways. She's not a comics fan. She did not grow up in this world, and I think that keeps me tethered a little bit. It's very easy to get lost in the weeds and so start valuing spectacle over substance. She's always kind of the first person where I'm like, hey, what do you think about this idea? And if she likes it, that usually means there's a human core that I can kind of get into, and the concept itself is not too convoluted that like a stranger wouldn't get it. And then if she seems a little more lukewarm, I'm like, okay, this is probably too complicated. I need to simplify this. I need to figure out what the human element is. But ultimately, I feel like the art of storytelling is making strangers give a damn. We can love our stuff because it's like the sunken cost fallacy. Like, we've spent all this time in pain and blood and sweat and tears. Of course we're going to love it. If you've ever watched a bad show on Netflix, we are not conditioned to think about like the human cost of entertainment. Like, we are very cold-blooded about it. I just watched the first 10 minutes of Project Power the other night, and I was like, nope, don't like this.
Really?
And this, I'm a creator who tends to think of himself as an empathetic person who really spent a long time thinking about the moral calculus of criticism. And I still, like, if I don't like something, I'm ruthless. Like, I don't force myself to watch anything. A lot of readers are like that. And so you have to earn their trust. You have to really earn their emotional investment and engagement. And I think by having an accessible high concept and by having a relatable human core, or maybe relatable is not the right word, but a human core that feels something a little more universal. And for me, I've always picked trauma. I think that goes a long way into that evangelizing that we talked about earlier. Every time I go to a show and somebody says, oh, I don't really read comics, I just smile and I say, that's excellent. You're the core target audience. You are my core demographic. Everybody's got a favorite comic. They just don't know what it is yet.
I almost wanted to touch upon the trauma thing because either you have some really deep-seated issues that you're trying to get out on these books here, and that's like cheaper than psychotherapy, or it's just something that you want to really touch upon.
I'm sure it's a little column A, a little column B. I listen. I love therapy. I love my therapist. She's like I said, she's one of the 3 women I trust most in my life, besides my mother and my girlfriend. But yeah, I do think that there were certainly time in my life where like I would look back on those kind of more traumatic moments, and I would certainly ruminate upon them and ruminate upon past injuries and past mistakes. I think we all do that to some degree. I do think, though, that my philosophy on trauma has changed. It's evolved, I should say, working in the O.Z., where it's always I think our traumas don't just shape us and shape our personalities and our responses to things and our likes and dislikes, but I think they kind of become the themes of our lives. In a lot of ways, the certain traumas we always circle back to, and sometimes it's every once in a while, but sometimes it's more frequent. And how we kind of face those traumas, I think, really sets the tenor of our lives. Sometimes we're lucky enough to be able to conquer them. Sometimes we're not, and sometimes we kind of spend our lives trying to escape these traumas or trying to bury them. But I think the idea of seeing a character be able to, if not transcend them, live with them, is something that I think is kind of universally cathartic. And I think that is kind of the universal thing that I always try to hit with my stories, is that like, just because you've been hurt, just because you've made a mistake, just because there's been something in your past, it reminds me of my favorite line from my favorite Jeff Johns issue of JSA, where Liberty Bell tells Damage his face has been all messed up and disfigured from Professor Zoom. And she points to her Liberty Bell logo on her chest, and she says, just because something has a crack in it doesn't mean you throw it away. And I think that's something that that's really, I think, the key message to a lot of my books. And I think that speaks to readers, I think, on a deep level.
You have 5 Ringo nominations. You have 4 books now, maybe 5 with the second issue of The O.Z. whenever that gets published as well too, coming out, if not more. You have
Yeah.
thousands of articles. You've interviewed thousands of people. You've been doing this for 10 years. You're professionally successful. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
Wow. That's a great question. Boy, I always consider myself a work in progress. And I think some of that's my upbringing. I was raised by two very high achieving people who have always pushed me to kind of push myself to the limit. So I'm not very good at accepting success. I always move the goalposts, and in that way, Kickstarter's been supremely unhealthy for me. um, it's all I take it day to day. I think there are days where I feel like a personal success. There are other days where I feel like I'm a gross failure. Um, it's every day is a struggle, and for me, it's just sort of my ongoing struggle is always being creatively patient and compassionate to myself, and knowing that Rome wasn't built in a day, and so you can't always write a story. You can either write it fast or you can write it right. And for me, I would always rather do it right and take my time. And that's a luxury I can afford as an indie guy, because I'm not chained to the double shipping month to month schedule. There's a lot more I want to do in my career, and there's a lot more that I want to do personally. I consider myself successful enough that I think I've got a shot at it, and that's ultimately all I can ask for.
Flip side of that is, how do you deal with your failures?
That's a great question. That I think is probably the most important question that you will ask any creative type. For me, privately is always the word that I always want to do it privately. I think it's so easy in today's social media connected world to vent publicly, or to to mouth off at a critic, or even just a reader who's being a jerk. And the thing is having been on the other side of the equation, like, not all of my reviews were positive. I tried to keep it not personal, about the work rather than the creator behind it. But I'm human. I mean, I'm sure there were reviews where I was a little more heated than I probably should have been, especially over 12 years of doing it. For me, it's always, I take setback. I vent about it to my friends. I try to, or my partner. I try to kind of get those bad feelings out. I try to disperse them as fast as humanly possible. But sometimes you got to take a little bit of time to lick your wounds, and just knowing that, like, once you've done that, then you can kind of reassess. The thing that I always struggle with is when bad things happen, or if I get into a disagreement with someone, or if somebody says something to me that's hurtful, my initial gut instinct is to sift through all of it to see if there's a kernel of truth. And that's something that, like, as a human being, I have kind of had to unlearn a little bit. But you really do have to take everything into consideration. You have to say, okay, like, if this book didn't get picked up, or if this person wrote a review and didn't like it, try to get a sense of perspective a little bit. Is this just one person talking, or is this an actual flaw with the work? Do they have a point? Usually by the time somebody's reviewing it, the book is long since set in stone, but you kind of can say to yourself, like, all right, how can I fix this in the next book? Or how can I correct this in the next book? Every single book that I've written has been a reaction to the one that came before it. Spencer and Locke was kind of a tight, intimate cast. So Going to the Chapel had 16 people trapped in one location. Spencer and Locke had a bunch of narrative captions, which I think can be good, but can also sometimes be a crutch. So Going to the Chapel had none of those. Spencer and Locke was kind of a dark psychological thriller. So Going to the Chapel was kind of a light on its feet heist book. So yeah, I mean, I consider myself fortunate that I look back on my work and I always say that I did it to the best of my ability, even if there are things that, like, looking back, I'm like, oh, I could have done this differently. I could have tried something else. But yeah, the failures, they're painful. You work hard to avoid them, but sometimes you step on a landmine, and it happens. And I've been fortunate enough that most of my failures I've been able to keep private. That it's not sort of a bigger misstep. But I think if I stay in this industry long enough, the law of averages is eventually going to come against me. There's going to be an issue or a book or a series that comes out that people aren't going to like. And I think for me, it's always about just remembering how lucky I am to be working in this industry, to have this platform, to have this job, and knowing that like anything that you do publicly is going to be punching down. So you really just have to kind of withdraw and take your space. And you can complain to the people who know and love you, and beyond that you just have to say, all right, like I took a swing, maybe it didn't connect with this reader or this reviewer or this publisher. Can I improve? If so, let's do it. And if not, tomorrow's another day and we'll take another swing.
The younger generation are looking at your work and they're becoming inspired, either to become a writer or to become a creative person in whatever they choose to be. And you have a lot of content to look at. They are going to look at this interview as well, and they're hopefully going to become inspired by your words and by your actions. Mm-hmm. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
I love these questions, by the way. These are some fantastic ways to close out the interview. I think it's just keep doing it. I think innovation comes by doing. And the whole reason that I can pinpoint the exact moment that I had permission to become a writer. And I had visited my father in St. Louis, and I was at CBS. I was not loving it. It was crushing my soul a bit. And my father's an eye surgeon. He loves his job. He lives and breathes and sleeps that job. And I remember going to our favorite pub, and he was saying, well, what do you want to do with your future? And I said, I'm not sure I want to stay at CBS much longer. And he asked me, what's the thing that only you can do? And I realized there are a lot of people who can write. I don't consider myself having a monopoly on that, obviously, but nobody can write the way that I write. And I realized, like, oh, that's something that I can add that's unique to the world. And that, I think, was kind of the moment that I walked through that door and said, maybe this is something I can do. And so I think that's where the innovation comes from. And I think that's where the inspiration comes from, is that, we all egg each other on. Anybody who does comics specifically, whether consuming them as a reader, as a fan, or somebody who decides to stick their head in the lion's mouth and become a creator, we do it for love of the game. And so whenever anybody puts something out, as long as it's sort of done from a place of good faith, people like that stuff. Even if the book is not necessarily their jam, I think, it's hard for me to look at an indie book and not be like, have some level of enthusiasm just because people are kind of laying it all out in the field and they're trying things. If anything, sometimes I get a little jealous when I see a book that I'm like, oh yeah, that guy like knows what's up. I wish I had that kind of idea. So yeah, I think, just keep doing it, and sort of, don't let the bastards rub you down. Like, it's just keep going. That's the advice that I would give any young creators, because you don't know who you're going to be inspiring, and you don't know who's going to look at your work as their seminal text. And so, beyond that, just kind of write for yourself, write so you can sleep at night. And beyond that, your tribe will come. And I think that's something that, it takes a few years to get there. But I think looking back on it, even now, even me being a little less than 5 years into it, seeing where I am now versus when I started, I don't think I could recognize that person if I looked in the mirror. And so, just stay the course, because I promise you, if you do it long enough, it will be worth it.
One last question, I guess, would be, is there anything that I missed not talking about the O.Z that you want to kind of bring up before we go to your social media?
Yeah, I mean, for the O.Z, like I said, Mad Max and the Hurt Locker beats the Wizard of Oz. we've kind of recontextualized Dorothy killing the Wicked Witch as something like a botched regime change. So when she clicked her heels together and went back to Kansas, she left Oz in a power vacuum, leading to years of brutal civil war. So our story picks up a generation later with Dorothy's granddaughter, who's a disillusioned Iraq war veteran. She's come home to Kansas to kind of put the pieces of her life back together when a tornado strikes, stranding this new Dorothy in the war-torn land of Oz. So she's going to have to confront her past and her grandmother's former friends, the Tin Soldier, the Scarecrow, and the Lion, in order to survive the occupied zone, or as the locals call it, the O.Z. And, like I said with Spencer and Locke, this is not a story for shock value's sake. I think the original text really supports our thesis in that Dorothy kills 2 wicked witches and convinces the wizard to leave in like a week. That would look like Baghdad. That would not be a happy ending. And I think it builds upon my themes of trauma. Where by exploring Dorothy as a soldier with PTSD, we're able to kind of explore the themes of trauma as well as enhance the scale, because she's so worried about kind of this moral calculus of war. With every choice you make, someone can wind up dead. And so how do you become a responsible leader in that? Can you ever escape the cycle of violence? So yeah, if you're a fan of Mad Max or The Old Guard or Fables or my previous work on Spencer and Locke, you're going to love this book. 44-page first issue is up on Kickstarter right now. You can go to bit.ly/the O.Z comic until the wee hours of September 16th. It'll be wrapping up that morning. You can also visit the OZ comic on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Pepose D. It's my last name, first initial, or David Pepose Comics on Facebook. Or you can subscribe to my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/Pep News. I tease all sorts of projects, including the OZ on that. So, that's kind of my spiel. Join us. Every backer matters. Every dollar counts. We want you as Yellow Brick Road Warrior. And thank you so much for having me, man. It really means the world.
Oh, not a problem. I really appreciate it, David, and I can't wait to see what else you have coming up. This is one of my more enlightening interviews I've had in a while.
Thank you.
I put this on the same line as Austin Hamplin, who is wrote a story for Top Cow and Image Comics for the Stairway Anthology that I did last week. So, truly,
thank you for
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. No, let's do this again sooner rather than later. Got more announcements coming soon. So, yes. But, I'm excited to be here, both in terms of this podcast and just the industry. I've tried all the stable jobs, so this is what I got. But yeah, it's just, you spend your whole life loving comics, and when you see a response to something like the OZ, comics loves you back.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a feeling I'm going to hold on to for a long time, because you don't get many experiences like this, and it's positively overwhelming, and I couldn't be more grateful.
Awesome. So, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talking. Of course, you can find this interview on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/user/TGT Media. Of course, our website is TGT Media or twogeekstalking.com. That's the word 2, not the number 2. You can, of course, find my social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Kurt Sasso, as it shows down below in the lower third. If you spell it with a C, you've been spelling it wrong for the past 12 years, so it hasn't changed. Next interview, though, we have next week is going to be Canadian punk rock singer and actress Biff Naked. She is coming on the show. It's going to be a super short interview, half-hour interview, not like our normal hour that we do here. So if you have questions, message me at Kurt Sasso on Twitter. We'll get those questions live if they're appropriate, and we'll have a wonderful, fun conversation with her, and I can't wait for that. That's kind of my highlight of year 12, so that's been a fun time. Again, thanks, David, for coming on the show. Appreciate it, and everyone for listening and watching. Tune in next week for another great interview on Two Geeks Talking, where everyone has a story to tell, and it's up to me to help bring that out.